if Ukraine gets invaded, what happens if there's war in that region, what happens if there are sanctions and that sort of thing. Well, now we're seeing it play out in real time. So I want to check back with Professor Wolff and see catch his thoughts on all this stuff. The latest, now that we have some actual real impacts and real numbers. He's the professor of economics, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. And you can tweet him. You can find him on Twitter at Prof Wolff with 2 F's on the end, rdwolff.com. Professor Wolff, welcome back. So what are you seeing as the impact of A, the conflict, B, the shutting down of Norstream 2, and C, these sanctions that we are putting on Russia?
Well, as you know, Tom, I try to approach things historically. And let me begin briefly with that. The United States has been slapping sanctions in the 1990s, the first 20 years of this century, over and over again, against a whole host of countries, but particularly Russia and particularly China. And let me be blunt here. There's not a shred of evidence to indicate that the ostensible foreign policy purposes that these sanctions were intended to achieve were in fact achieved. When Russia went into the Crimea in 2014, there were all kinds of sanctions. Did they leave the Crimea? No. Did they stop with their attitude of protecting themselves by controlling to some extent what goes on in the Ukraine? No. Did it prevent them from doing what they've just done? No. There's no evidence at all that these sanctions are effective in changing foreign policy. But there is a lot of evidence that they do change us internally. For example, when President Trump said, I'm putting tariffs on Chinese goods, and boy, will make the Chinese pay. Many of us who are economists and teach basic economics had to point out, not that it worked all that well, that tariffs are paid here by the American companies that import stuff from China and are usually passed on to the rest of us as higher prices. We, not the Chinese, would be paying. China last year, during the time of these tariffs, had the best export year in the history of the country. The sanctions didn't hurt them, but it did contribute to the inflation here. Again and again, you're going to see it now, too. It's a little hard to predict because we don't know how long these will last, and we don't know what reaction the Russians, Chinese, who are now their allies, what steps they will take, and they have reacted in the past with their own sanctions. So here's what we're fairly confident of. The price of oil and gas is going to go up. That's for sure. How far, how long, we don't know. But since that's an input to every other price, because everything that comes to us in a store had to get there by a truck, which uses oil or gas, we're going to see our inflation get worse. And then there's going to be a real moment for the American people. Is it worth the damage you are going through to maneuver around a place on the map which, let's be honest, most Americans could not find?
Well, and I know that the Obama administration was, and frankly the Bush administration before them, was claiming that the sanctions on Iran brought Iran to the negotiating table with regard to the JCPOA, as I recall it's called. But to the best of my knowledge, that's the only time that anybody has ever even claimed that sanctions have been effective. I mean, all sanctions did with Cuba, for example, was create a rally around the flag around Fidel Castro. All the sanctions did on Venezuela was turn Hugo Chavez into a superhero. We've seen that repeated, so I get that. But with regard to the price of oil, I mean, we had in the 1970s, when the U.S. took the side of Israel in the what was it, the 7-Day War was it called? I forget the name of the war, but you know what I'm talking about. And the Arab countries cut off our supply of oil. We had this explosion in the oil price, And the consequence of that was a decade of inflation. And there are those who argue that it takes about a decade to wring that kind of inflation out of an economy, whether the Fed raises interest rates or not, which is another question. You know, is that a practical strategy? And sure enough, it took a decade, although we went through some real horrible pain. But what might we expect? I mean, are we looking at $200 oil prices and 20% inflation here in the United States and in Western Europe?
Well, the amazing thing is, the only honest answer to your question is those are now possible, and they weren't that extremely possible as little as a few weeks ago. Look, every businessman and woman in the world right now is confronting rising inflation. 7 to 8% in this country, and even in countries that don't have that high, they know it's coming and it's going to be tough. You know what they know now? It's going to be worse than what they expected. It's going to last longer. And every businessman and woman who wants to raise their price to offset their rising costs, to make more profit, to compensate for the last 2 years of pandemic and economic crash during which their profits were negatively impacted. Every one of them wants to raise price, but is afraid that if they do so, the public will be angry at them, boycott them more or less. They all now have an excuse. The world headlines blaring about Ukraine, Russia, the United States, Europe, this happening, that happening. In that kind of a cloud, you can get away with almost anything. And businesses are going to be using the excuse, oh, I didn't want to raise my price, but you see, there were some supply chain disruptions because of what the Russians did or threatened to do, or because of what the European sanctions were, and on and on and on. And in that smoke, they will get away, which is one of the few things you're confident of looking at this, is that whatever happens on the ground in the Ukraine, the cost to the American people in inflation, in all the dislocations of an inflation, in the growing gap between rich and poor that inflation always imposes on people because the workers cannot catch up with wages to keep pace with the rising prices most of the time. You put all that together, and we're going to be paying yet again for a foreign policy like the tariffs in China that did not do what they were used to excuse. It's very hard, and I see it in the European press. It's very hard not to think at this point that Mr. Biden, who's had a lot of troubles in his first year or so, now can be Mr. Tough Guy and look a little bit better, just as Mr. Trump did with his attacks on China, just as Boris Johnson is trying to distract from his career-ending shenanigans that are otherwise the front page news.